In his study of the psychology of religion, 1935, Dr. Cornelius Van Til called attention to the difference between the Christian and the modern view of man and his psychology. Quote, "The activity by which personality realizes itself is, to be sure, very genuine and significant, but it is genuine and significant only because it acts before the background of the plan of God. The integration of personality, that is, the constant readjustment of the particular and the universal within itself, and the constant readjustment of the whole personality as an individual to the universal found in the universe beyond itself, takes place by a more ultimate and constant readjustment of the individual together with his surroundings to God, who is the absolute particular and the absolute universal combined in one ultimate personality." My mouth is full of slobbers. Slibbery, slibbery. The integration of personality, according to the Christian view, is an integration toward, and by virtue of, an ultimate self-sufficient personality. End quote. In contrast with this, the modern concept of the integration of personality is an integration into the void. We can best appreciate this if we note that the concept of purpose itself has been completely internalized. End quote. This emphasis in humanistic evolutionary psychology is not on knowing man in terms of the image of God in him, but on looking backward on the evolutionary ladder. The child is thus the key to the adult. Primitive man determines modern man, and primordial man is to be understood in terms of his animal inheritance. We have an integration downward into the void. Various modern psychologies have differing views of man, but they agree on man's evolutionary and primitive past as the key to his present. Thus, Sigmund Freud found his explanation in the belief, as set forth by Robertson Smith, that man's basic nature, as determined by his primordial ancestors, is the will to kill the father, to copulate with the mother and sisters, and to eat the father. But God created the first man as a full-grown man. His problem is not a primitive origin, but sin. He is responsible to God, but the human being of evolution is responsible to nothing and to no one. In Van Til's words, quote, "The real reason why modern psychology has left no room for responsibility is found in the fact that it has taken the whole of the human personality in all its aspects, self-conscious and subconscious, and immersed it in an ultimate metaphysical void. Man cannot be responsible to the void. Hence, the only way in which man can establish human responsibility is by showing the ultimate irrationalism of all non-theistic thought, of which modern psychology is but a particular manifestation. In that way, we place man self-consciously and subconsciously in every aspect of his person before the personality of God. Man is responsible in the whole of his personality, but only if he is the creature of God. Man, before God, is the only alternative to man in the world." End quote. Modern, irresponsible and lawless man is the inevitable product of modern evolutionary thought. If man is to be explained in terms of an animal past, then man, with more intelligence, will far exceed animals in his rapacity because he believes he knows that there is nothing that can restrain him. Humanistic religions, Van Til added, become means of adjustment and integration into the void. Because of man's kinetic wish that there be no God, he prefers the void to God and God's holy purpose. He dedicates himself to the destruction of all meaning from above. Reverence for nature replaces reverence from God. Why did I do that? Reverence for nature replaces reverence for God. One result has been Gaia worship, the uncritical worship of the natural world. To cite one example, Alan S. Miller, retired academic coordinator and senior lecturer in the Department of Conservation and Resource Studies, the University of California at Berkeley, is the author of the book Gaia Connections, An Introduction to Ecology, Ecoethics and Economics. My mouth is full of the celebrity. For him, quote, ecological health is an uniquely feminist issue, end quote. As a result, he sees as, quote, a minimal set of affirmations, end quote, the following, quote, 1. There are important and necessary connections between the oppression and exploitation of women and the oppression and exploitation of nature. 2. An understanding and comprehension of the nature of these connections is very much necessary to any adequate understanding of the double oppression around us of women and of nature. 3. All feminist theory and practice must therefore include an ecological perspective to be whole. 4. Any solution to ecological problems, it follows, must include a feminist perspective in order to comprehend the problem, end quote. Smith's position is more logical than that of many who disagree with them. The further from nature, the less ethical man becomes, so that a patriarchal class is seen as an oppressing class. Smith places ethics on, quote, the entire world of nature, end quote, rather than, quote, simply on human beings, end quote. Implicit in Gaia worship is the belief that women are more primitive and natural and therefore closer to nature than men, especially patriarchal Christian men. The ethics of Gaia worship are usually anti-Christian and affirmative of moral practices forbidden in God's law. This integration downward into the void has not been restricted to feminism and environmentalism. Modern art was a leader in this effort. It was marked early in the 20th century to a hostility to order and to form. It deconstructed both man and nature, and it approved of a disintegration of norms. Telling indictments of modern art have been written in great numbers, as, for example, William Snaith's The Irresponsible Arts, 1964. Their weakness is that they bypass the revolt against God, which is a revolt against purpose, patterns and meaning in every sphere. Alan Levy wrote about The Culture Vultures, 1968. But in a world without God, what's wrong with vultures? They're an aspect of nature. The student revolution of the 1960s has been accurately described by Peter Collier and David Horowitz in The Destructive Generation, 1989. Many of the students were not only destructive but childish. They took a delight in urinating and defecating publicly, using obscene language and copulating on campus grounds. This was an aspect of their integration downward into the void. Having rejected authority from above, that of God, parents, community, police, university officials, and others, they affirmed in practice an affirmation of things below. The criminal became even a folk hero to some. The willful blindness to anything but power from below marked more than students. Paul Davies and John Gribben in The Matter Myth, 1992, give an excellent account of the death of the long-established premises of materialism. They write at times as though the only logical alternative to the old science is creationism, but they specifically reject it. They recognize that, quote, all science is founded on the assumption that the physical world is ordered, end quote. Physics is the most powerful expression of this order. Quote, nobody knows where these laws come from. Nobody knows where these laws come from, nor why they operate universally and unfailingly. End quote. In spite of this, Davies and Gribben insist of, quote, seeing, end quote, that the Earth may be, quote, in some sense a simple living organism, end quote, Gaia. The word atom may be no more than a code word rather than, quote, an independent part of reality, end quote, but Gaia is more real than the atom. The authors even raise in passing a question about heliocentricity, 19 following, but they do not consider God and creationism as an option. But they do not consider God and creationism as an option. Their source is the void. An environmentalist has observed that, as he looks at nature and what man has done to it, he is ashamed of being a man. This is a new definition of sin and a logical one. Sin is any offence against whatever is ultimate in our universe of thought. If God is ultimate, then sin is any want of conformity to the law of God, 1 John 3:4. If nature is ultimate, then sin is any violation of that world of nature. For Albert Schweitzer, this meant that he did not kill insects and he picked up worms after a rain to replace them on the earth, lest they be stepped on in the pathways. It also troubled his conscience to be killing germs as a doctor. With his, quote, reverence for life, end quote, sin was an offence against worms, insects, any insects, any and every form of life. Every religion has its own concept of ultimacy, and it defines sin in terms of it. The growing Sadean faith of our time goes beyond such Eastern cults as the Jains to assert a most radical contempt of man in the name of worshipping nature. The record of paganism isn't a good one. Hinduism's reverence for animal life has gone hand in hand with the caste system. Indifference to suffering and mass killings such as the many millions killed when India gained, quote-unquote, freedom after World War II. The rise of the Sadean faith in the West has been accompanied by the phenomenal increase in all kinds of crimes. Crimes of violence against people can perhaps be explained by the hatred of many against mankind as the ostensibly evil animal raping the earth. Then why do... Hang on a second. Didn't come through. Then why do so many set fire to forests? Is not Gaia worship to some degree not only a hatred of man, but also of life? Evolution was once seen as identical with progress, so that man was the high point of all being. That faith in an inevitable progress is now waning, if not gone. Sad rejected God and therefore life. His demand was for a universal death, and the same death wish is present in his heirs and followers. Proverbs 8:35-36 tells us, quote, for whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favour of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. Try that again. Try that end bit portion. All they that hate me love death. Det är små meter. Det är små meter, Sultan. All right, folks. Shalala bing bong. I think we shall continue on. 12:48. All right, so let's do that. Okay, so chapter 18. Nice short chapter here. Chapter 18. Power. Original sin, according to Genesis 3:5, is man's desire to be his own God, knowing or determining good and evil for himself. becoming his own source for all law and morality. Man seeks to be his own God in rebellion against God. Man's will to be God does not mean emulating the goodness, grace, or mercy of God. Albert Camus stated the goal clearly, quote, "Since God claims all that is good in man, it is necessary to decide what is good and choose what is evil." End quote. The focus is on power, man's desire to play God by the exercise, if possible, of total power. Horrifying stories are told of the vicious delight of the Bolsheviks in their treatment of the men and women of the old order. This was nothing new in history. The terrorism used by ancient Assyria, the destruction of life, property and marriage by the Mazdakites of Persia in the 5th century AD, the French and Russian revolutions, and indeed the routine conduct of warfare over the centuries is a long tale of willful atrocities. For example, Genghis Khan held, quote, "The greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies and chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth and see those dear to them bathed in tears, to ride their horses and clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters." End quote. This language is close to that of modern de-Christianized men when liquor loosens their tongues. But this lust for power takes forms other than that of Genghis Khan's. It can be scientific, it can be expressed in a desire to control or create life. Jenna Correa, a feminist, has written, "The Mother Machine, Reproductive Technologies from Artificial Insemination to Artificial Wombs," 1985, horrifying accounts of the experimentations with birth. The results are commonly deadly, but the experiments continue. The dream is, among other things, to produce babies through men made into artificial females. Some have claimed to have transplanted mouse embryos into male mice. The desire for the power to control is so great that physicians in one medical journal actually wrote, quote, "It may well be that during the next 42 years, the allowing of a vaginal delivery or attempted vaginal delivery may need to be justified in its..." Look, this is, it's a fact, you know, how many cesareans there are. Wow. May need to be justified in each particular instance. Perhaps it is not altogether too provocative to suggest that vaginal delivery may yet become the exception rather than the rule. End quote. Eggs are apparently taken from women without their consent to be used in experimentation. Too commonly, those in power equate intelligence with power so that they see other people as experimental animals and themselves as working for science and therefore justified in their planning. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor in The Brothers Karamazov equated his controls with wisdom and the good of mankind. "I need to take a drink of poo, baby." He saw Christ's position as unrealistic because it required freedom, personal decision and conversion. The Grand Inquisitor tells Christ, quote, "Oh, ages are yet to come of the confusion of free thought, of their science and cannibalism. For having begun to build their Tower of Babel without us, they will end, of course, with cannibalism. But then the beast will crawl to us and lick our feet and spatter them with tears of blood." Try again. "But then the beast will crawl to us and lick our feet and spatter them with tears of blood. And we shall sit upon the beast and raise the cup, and on it will be written, Mystery. But then, and only then, the reign of peace and happiness will come for men. Thou art proud of thine elect, but thou hast only the elect, while we give rest to all. And besides, how many of those elect, those mighty ones who could become elect, have grown weary of waiting for thee, and have transferred and will transfer the powers of their spirit and the warmth of their heart to the other camp, and end by raising their free banner against thee. Thou didst thyself. Thou didst thyself lift up thy banner, that banner, shillabato. Thou didst thyself lift up thy Thou didst thyself lift up that banner, but with us all will be happy and will no more rebel nor destroy one another as under thy freedom. Oh, we shall persuade them that they will only become free when they renounce their freedom to us and submit to us. And shall we be right, or shall we be lying? They will be convinced that we are right, for they will remember the horrors of slavery and confusion to which thy freedom brought them. Freedom, free thought and science, will lead them unto such straits, and will bring them face to face with such marvels and insoluble mysteries, that some of them, the fierce and rebellious, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy one another, while the rest, weak and unhappy, will crawl fawning to our feet and whine to us, "Yes, you were right. You alone possess his mystery, and we come back to you. Save us from ourselves." End quote. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor contrasts the freedom of the spirit against a controlling church which distrusts freedom. Dostoevsky saw things as still in the framework of Christendom, whereas George Orwell in 1948, viewed the scene in terms of the growing power of humanistic socialism. For Orwell's new men, God is dead. He is also forgotten. Truth and meaning are man-made, not God-given. One of the three main party slogans in Oceania is, quote, "Freedom is slavery." A second is, "Big Brother is watching you." And the third, "War is peace." These and their implementations serve to obliterate man as God created him in order to create the state-made man. One of the tragedies of Orwell's life is that, much as he hated this goal, he believed it to be possible, and in fact, in the process of realization, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World had not gone quite so far in its pessimism. Modern man's dreams of utopia have become dystopias. Science fiction writers have transferred the utopian dream to distant planets and galaxies, but they have only succeeded in transplanting original sin and the struggle for power across the cosmos. Feminism has extended the power struggle into the relationship of the sexes. It's becoming tough. The children's rights advocates see the power struggle as indigenous to family life. Having denied God and his law, modern man has denied any morality other than a self-made and purely personal one. The ethics propounded by philosophers and politicians and educators have no God-given and eternal value. They are pragmatically created and pragmatically abandoned, even as treaties between nations are. Charles Oliver, the astute commentator for Reason, has cited a telling incident. Quote, "Andy Hanson's parents weren't too pleased when he brought home a C in math, so they did the only thing good parents can do. They sued his teacher. After a year and $4,000 in legal fees, $8,500 for the Contra Costa County, California school district, the Hansons got a verdict. The C stands. The father says he'll appeal. We went in and we tried to make a deal. They wanted a C, we wanted an A, so why not compromise on a B? But they dug in their heels, and here we are. End quote. If the child only earned a C, why not a C? No ethical consideration is cited, only the desire to have one's will done. This is the modern mulde. This is the modern mood. Self-will and power govern modern man. James W. McGray has summarized the difference between Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor and Orwell's O'Brien very aptly. Quote, "For the inquisitors of old, God is love, but for the new inquisitors, God is pure power." End quote. Orwell's vision of this new order stresses power. The future is about stamping on a human face forever. This is the logical conclusion of Genesis 3:5 of the Tempter's program. It is a vision of death. Alrighty, let's continue with 19. Chapter 19. Revolution and Death. There are two remarkable passages in Job that tells us much about Satan. Okay, I did that wrong, didn't I? Bad. Apart from the reading. Okay. Let's do this. There are two remarkable passages in Job that tell us much about Satan. The first, Job 1:9-11, has a startling nature. Satan expresses a total distrust in any goodness in man. Quote, "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." End quote. Again, Job is high level low. Again, after Job is sore smitten, Satan demands more testing, saying, quote, "And Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. But put vowels are failing me. But put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." Job 2:4-5. Satan sees man as totally, irreparably depraved. For him, the creature can only be governed by self-interest, and Satan sees God as naive and ignorant because of his confidence in Job. Satan's cynicism is an exercise in self-justification. Being himself fallen, and because his will is to be his own God, he sees all mankind as incapable of any other course than self-will. His temptation in the Garden of Eden was to declare that every man can be his own God, determining good and evil for himself. Genesis 3:5. The only quote-unquote good will is self-will. There is no absolute and binding norm or law. Every man lives beyond God's good and evil and determines his own law and morality. Thus, in terms of God's law, all men are eternally evil. For Satan, liberation comes in living beyond God's law and beyond God's plan for man. This same perspective governs Satan's temptation of Jesus Christ in the wilderness. In the Greek text, Satan does not say, quote, "If thou be the Son of God," end quote, Matthew 4, 3 and 6. Rather, but rather, quote, "If thou be a Son of God," end quote, despite this below. Just not getting it, not getting it. Despite this expressed cynicism, Satan knew whom he had before him. His temptations are important in telling us what his plan and purpose are. The first temptation is to minister to mankind. Why do I not read the thing? The first temptation is to minister to mankind's economic needs. Turn these stones into bread. Matthew 4:33. Again, I'm not reading. I think I'm coming at the end of my. Matthew 4:3. If God has the holy and righteous or just character he claims, why does he allow the poor to remain poor and hungry? This is a declaration of the priority of need over faith, of welfarism over character. Second, Satan demands that Jesus Christ make faith unnecessary by a public demonstration of angelic power and rescue. Why should men be compelled to manifest faith under adversity and fire? Third, Satan demands that Christ fall down and worship him as the true friend and liberator of mankind. Satan thereby declares himself to be the true liberation. Liberator? Surely it's liberator. Satan thereby declares himself to be the true liberation and Messiah of mankind. Satan sees himself as the one who delivers man from the bondage of God, law, and morality. Every man can then realize his own potential apart from God. Man must think of his own possibilities positively and reject the judgments of God and his law against himself. By this, Satan has reversed the moral order. He sees God as evil, as hostile to human potentiality. In a sense, God is the unreal because his requirements go against the reality of man. For Satan, the fall and the expulsion from Eden represents God's accordance. For Satan, the fall and the expulsion from Eden represents God's evil hostility to man's attempt to liberate himself. For him, the idea of God as the lawgiver and redeemer is an illegitimate pretension. God may be the source of all things, but for Satan, this does not make him the controller nor lawgiver, far from it. St. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 11:13-15, quote, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works." End quote. Neither Satan nor his servants see themselves as the agents of sin and darkness, but rather as liberators, as angels of life. They are in the church and in the world to enlighten and to deliver people from their bondage to God. They see mankind. I want to be clearer there. Quote unquote, bondage to God. They see mankind as enslaved by God, and it is their religious purpose to free humanity. They have their own zealous sense of calling to liberate mankind from bondage to a false doctrine of God, and their true, if unavowed, God is Satan. Such men have been Gnostics, heretics, modernists, antinomians, and more. They have adulterated the gospel, often in Christ's name. Their goal is man's salvation rather than the glory of God, because man has priority with them. The God of Scripture redeems men for his kingdom and his holy and eternal purposes, not to give men peace of mind and a ticket to heaven. These pretended angels of light reverse God's order. For them, what the Bible calls evil and sin is reality. Because their primary focus is man, they see God's law word as unreal, remote, and non-pertinent. They mine the Bible for nuggets that can be used to minister to men's being. Our Lord says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness," or justice, quote, "and all these things shall be added unto you." Matthew 6:33. But men reject this, not God's kingdom and justice, but their own peace of mind, deliverance from problems, and so on are wanted. This is not the gospel of Christ, but the pretended ministries of light. Now, if the church is so derelict, should we be surprised that the world is as perverse as it is? Now, if the church is so derelict, should we be surprised that the world is as perverse as it is? We're making progress. Should we be surprised that the world is as perverse as it is? There is widespread and growing vindication of evil as good, as the good. Men preach on the healing potential in adultery or teach it in counselling. Abortion, homosexuality are legalized and protected, and so on. What was once called evil is now defined as good, because the sole remaining good, now in process of being made fully legitimate, is to affirm man's freedom to do what he pleases. The one condition is that none be harmed, and that limitation is waning. Increasingly, the idea of any supernatural power, any purpose in life, or any meaning is regarded as not only untenable, but unfit for any public forum. Thus, Dean Kenyon, a biologist at San Francisco State University, was forbidden to teach that intelligent design is apparent in the universe. His views are not creationism. An authority on chemical evolutionary theory and the study of origins, he began to doubt the validity of his own work. His expression of doubt led to being forbidden to teach on the subject. The offence of such teaching as Kenyon's is that it opens up the possibility of a transcendental origin, purpose, or meaning. The modern definition of light is that which comes from below. A reading of Puritan autobiographies or personal accounts of their spiritual pilgrimage is revelatory of a certain fact, one which from Augustine on through the medieval era is very prevalent. While unbelief and cynicism were not uncommon in those eras, so too a lively sense of necessary purpose to life was quite commonplace. As a result, spiritual crises resulted in conversion experiences. Now, these crises are emphatically not lacking in our time, but there is a difference. The background has changed as the intellectual environments then pointed to some kind of cosmic meaning and purpose. Since Darwin, the intellectual context has changed radically. Purpose and meaning from above are denied. During the era from 1920 to 1940, many books by scientists pointed to a non-Christian purpose in the universe. Yeah, let's get a little bit Joe Biden on it. Many books by scientists pointed to a non-Christian purpose in the universe. Such books sold well and were soon forgotten. The academic community treated them with contempt and scorn. However, however outstanding the qualifications of the scientists, their pursuit of meaning from above rather than below meant their instant disqualification. The writings were dismissed as regressive, and in one instance, a professor said of such a scientist that non-Christian purpose in the universe. All right, I'm just lost now. That age and the approach of death had led him to wishful thinking. Meaning and purpose were untenable concepts, even though these men believed in evolution, not devolution. If the one be true, why not the other? Chance can work both upward and downward. This rigid limitation placed on reality is very prevalent in the church world, in seminaries and in colleges. Thus, Father Raymond E. Brown is a recipient of over 20 honorary doctorates from both Catholic and Protestant universities and Professor Emeritus of Biblical Studies at Union Theological Seminary, New York, New York. He is also the author of The Birth of the Messiah, a commentary on the infancy narrative in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, 1977-1993. The book bears the imprimatur of the Catholic Archdiocese of New York. Its emphasis is naturalistic. Father Brown, Father Brown, get down. Father Brown remarks of the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14 of a virgin birth that, quote, "This conception of prophecy as prediction has disappeared from serious scholarship today," end quote. This is a statement of amazing arrogance. Quote, "Serious scholarship today," end quote, means for Brown scholarship that is a priori naturalistic and hostile to the obvious meaning of the Bible. There are more than a few scholars of this century whose view of prophecy is totally different from Brown's. He, however, rejects all contrary opinions as unworthy of consideration. This is the usual modernist dogmatism parading as, quote, "objective," end quote, and scientific. The latter half of the 20th century has not been lacking in intense partisan conflicts, mass protests, demonstrations and riots, all in the name of one cause or another. But this passionate devotion to causes or issues is not matched by a like dedication to religious and moral faith as such. Faith does not command as issues do. Never has hatred been more condemned and more practiced. Kenneth Keniston, in his study of post-World War II youth, saw them as, quote, "strong in opposition, weak in affirmation," end quote. What they? End quote. Theirs is, quote, "the cult of the present." This existential emphasis on the present is existentialist and leads to a radical self-absorption because the governing reality is the self. Together with this, there is a greater worth given to protest than to patient, long-term work to reform things. They, quote, "prefer role-playing to deep devotion," end quote. Keniston observed with telling clarity, quote, "A man's sense of his own place in time and of his place in a society and world located in history is central to his definition of himself, just as a society's definition of its place in history is one of the most distinguishing features of that society," end quote. But if a man has no religious definition of himself in terms of a transcendental order, in terms of the triune God, he will have no meaning that transcends himself. Definition then becomes a problem. What is man? Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, answered it thus, quote, I rebel, therefore we exist. End quote. A lot of mouth yum-yums. Satan, in speaking to Eve, defined himself and mankind by negation. Yea, hath God said, Genesis 3:1. But whenever man begins to define himself by negation against God, then man's temper becomes revolutionary. He sees himself as chained and he demands freedom. Revolutionary freedom is the liberty to negate, hate, deface, and kill. Centuries of achievement were destroyed by the French and Russian revolutions, for example. The works of great French composers largely disappeared. The great negator, the Marquis de Sade, had his property devastated. The mobs looted his chateau, carried away what they could and smashed what they could not. They did to Sade's chateau what he strove to do to civilization. Beautiful objects were systematically smashed. In the words of Donald Thomas, quote, even beauty was now suspect as an emblem of former aristocratic privilege. End quote. All this was logical in Sade's world, a universe without God, morality, and law. Revolutionary freedom is the power to destroy and kill without hindrance. The revolutionist seeks to display it. The revolutionist seeks to suspend the laws of God and men and to mutilate and smash at will. Revolution is the basic premise of the modern age because of its anti-Christian character and its determined will to obliterate Christianity and the Christian past. Revolution often comes disguised as education, as in the case of John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. In his lectures, A Common Faith, Dewey objected to supernatural Christianity as an anti-democratic. He's very frustrating. Okay, I'm just lost now. Dewey objected to supernatural Christianity as anti-democratic because it divides men into the saved and the lost, saints and sinners, and in terms of heaven and hell. The immediate application of Dewey's vision was the abolition in some schools of grading and of passing and failing. But Deweyism does not stop there. It is a totally democratic vision. If no heaven and hell division is tolerable, then no division between the law-abiding citizen and the criminal is tenable. We have seen a major step towards such a democracy in a statement by a prominent U.S. Attorney General of the duty of that office to protect the guilty. When the city of Herculaneum buried together with Pompeii in the eruption of Vesuvius on Augustus. I was in the Roman mode, so I said Augustus. On August the 24th, AD 1979. And my brain go pop, pop. Toot, toot. '79 was excavated. An inscription on one wall carried a proverb. Who does not know how to defend himself does not know how to survive. The problem now is more serious. A powerful element in the modern world has no intention of defending its civilization, because while murderous towards Christianity, it is suicidal with regard to itself. As Proverbs 8:35 and 36 tells us, For whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favour of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death. That's wrong, innit? Love death. You love cats. Doop doop doopy doo. Flashback to the 80s there. All right, thanks for listening. Much appreciated. Go to nathanteacher.com if you want to see the progress, or make a. You can support the work, extend the work, help extend the work by giving a one-off donation. That'd be great. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you in the next chapters. I hope